It's October 2025 and it's the literal calm before the storm as a beautiful sunrise welcomes our cruise ship to the largest city in Asturias, Gijón. Day 4 of our cruise and we've arrived in Gijón, or Gijón as it's pronounced in Asturian, though the actual cruise port is quite a long way out of town, which is going to be a problem as the incoming weather means that our time in the city has been dramatically cut short, with the captain wanting us to depart by 2 p.m. rather than the scheduled 5 p.m. Thankfully, the half-day tour of Gijón that we'd booked had us coming back to the ship by 1:30 and was consequently the only short excursion of the day that had survived. So a little after 10, we headed down to the coach and off for a tour of the city, first heading out to a viewpoint on the far eastern side of the city centre. The Mirador de la Providencia sits some 4 kilometres from the centre of the city and 7 kilometres from the port, providing views over the whole sweep of the small bay that the city sits within, with particularly good views of the Villa, the oldest part of the city, built out on a small peninsula that was easy to defend and has been occupied since at least the Roman period, if not before. From the viewpoint, the tour then had a scenic drive back through the city before stopping off at a historic hotel for tapas and the chance to taste the local Asturian cider before returning to the ship for our early departure. The city has a rich history which, sadly, we had little time to explore due to our early departure, but in a quick rundown, archaeological excavations of the area suggest that humans have been living in the area around Gijón for around 7,000 years, with 2 Malayan Neolithic dolmens being discovered in the 1990s. Romans, Visigoths, capital of the Muslim territories for the short period for the Moorish conquest of Spain, made it all the way to the north coast. Captured by the Spanish in the First Battle of the Reconquista that would last over 600 years, destroyed in wars in the 14th century, rebuilt as a major fishing port in the 15th and 16th centuries, expanded beyond the Villa in the 17th and 18th centuries, 19th century port expansion to handle the booming coal export industry, initially supported the Republican faction of the Spanish Civil War before falling to Franco's troops in 1937, latter part of the 20th century saw the decline of industry, in particular iron manufacturing. 21st century the city moved towards the services sector, with it starting to attract cruise ships and the establishment of a campus of the University of Oviedo in the city. On departing A Coruña the previous evening, the captain explained that our delayed departure had been caused by them negotiating a major change to our schedule to avoid Storm Benjamin, which was going to cause some pretty nasty seas in the Bay of Biscay and could have made docking in Santander difficult, if not impossible. Instead of continuing east along the northern Spanish coast and then having to cross diagonally back through the Bay of Biscay at the height of the storm, we were instead going to turn round at Gijón and make as quick an exit as possible from the bay and seek shelter in the port of Vigo on Spain's Atlantic coast, where a mooring point and times had been negotiated during the period of delay the previous afternoon. It also explained why we were departing Gijón several hours ahead of schedule in a desperate attempt to get out of the Bay of Biscay before the worst weather hit, with storm force 10 rising to hurricane force 12 winds and sea heights of 8 metres plus predicted. The captain wanted as much time as possible to flee the bay. Which is why the following morning our pre-dawn and slightly damp arrival was into Vigo on Galicia's Atlantic coast and not the scheduled Santander. And despite the captain's best efforts, it'd still been a rough night, with us hitting hurricane force 12 winds head-on as we rounded Cape Finisterre to exit Biscay and head into the wider Atlantic Ocean. Whilst A Coruña might be the more important port, Vigo is the largest city, with its population of nearly 300,000, making it the most populous city in Galicia. Much like Gijón, there is evidence of Neolithic settlement in the area, with dolmens dating back at least 5,000 years. The natural geography of the area, with lots of high ground that was easy defendable, led to the development of Castros from the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, with 28 settlements being identified in the Vigo region. The Romans arrived early, sometime around the 2nd century BCE, turning the area into an important port. During the Middle Ages, pirate attacks on the city drove the population inland, and privateers in the form of Francis Drake made 2 attempts on the city. A failed raid in 1585 followed 4 years later by him burning much of the city to the ground. In the early 19th century, the population rose up against the occupying French forces of Napoleon, driving them from the city. Vigo's position on the Atlantic coast made it an important port for trade with America, and this helped the city grow rapidly during the latter part of the 19th century. But in the 20th century, that turned into an outflow of people as thousands of Galicians emigrated to America through the port. Today, the port is still a major part of the town, being the main shipping point for Stellantis, the car giant formed by the merger of PSA Peugeot Citroën with Fiat Chrysler in 2021. High on the hill above the city sits a 17th century interpretation of those Castros in the Bronze and Iron Age, the fortress of El Castro, originally built by the Spanish in 1665 during the Portuguese Restoration War to defend the region from attacks by the English, though the war saw the oldest alliance in the world, Portugal and England, being joined by the French and Dutch to fight the Spanish. Less than 50 years later, and with France now on Spain's side, the fortress saw action during the Battle of Vigo Bay on the 23rd and 24th of October 1702, when a combined Dutch-English fleet attacked and defeated the French and Spanish navies. "17 years later, the English were back and captured the fortress along the city during the War of Quadruple Alliance. France, back now of Great Britain, Austria and Savoy, with the Dutch pitching in as well for old time's sake to take on the Spanish. During the Peninsular War in 1809, the fortress was occupied by the French army until, on the 28th of March, the local population rose up against the French and drove them from the town, with Spanish forces taking control of El Castro. Today, its location high on a hill overlooking the port makes it a popular park for both locals and tourists, and cruise tour groups, with 3 different Arcadia shore excursion groups all descending on the site a short while after breakfast. The next stop on our tour was the Pazo de Castrelos, a 17th century manor house and stately home located in the park of the same name to the south of the city centre. Originally the Pazo de la Vendera, it was built around 1670 and passed through various families before being inherited by Maria de los Milagros el Doyen, the 7th Marchioness of Valadares, and her husband Fernando Ginones de Leon, the Marquess of Alcedo, who undertook a major renovation of the building in the latter part of the 19th century. Following the Marchioness's death, the estate passed into the hands of her son, Fernando Quinones de Loyen Doyen, the 8th Marquess. However, in 1918 he died childless, and so the estate passed to his father and his wife, with the latter allowed to live in the manor house for the remainder of her life. Six years later, the father donated the property to the people of Vigo, stipulating that a museum and park be set up in the house and grounds. After negotiations with the council, an agreement on compensation was worked out with the 8th Marquess's widow to renounce her right of abode in 1935, and 2 years later, the Ginones de Leon Museum and Park opened for public. Today, the museum is the city's archaeological museum, tracing the history of Vigo and the region from the prehistoric to medieval periods. The 20 hectares of parkland are now a popular public park, but within the walls of the manor house there are also the formal gardens of the estate, which can be visited and wandered around, including a 3-tiered garden made up of a rose garden, French garden and English garden, the latter complete with a folly. After the visit to the garden, the tour concluded with a scenic drive around the city and a stop at a historic hotel for tapas. I'm sensing a theme developing with P&O shore excursions before heading back to the ship. As the shore excursion was only for the morning, we were back on board of the boat in time for lunch, albeit not needing much given the tapas less than an hour earlier. As our departure time wasn't until 4 p.m, it did mean I had a couple of hours to head back out into the city for some self-exploration, starting with getting a good look at our ship moored up at the Estación Marítima de Vigo. At the top of the centre of the old town, and only later in the day did I discover, linked there by a series of escalators which would have taken quite a bit of the effort out of getting up here, is the Castelo de San Sebastián. This castle was built 9 years before El Castro, at the same time as the city started to have its walls constructed under the orders of Philip IV of Spain. The site was originally a hermitage dedicated to Saint Sebastian, and the new fortifications enclosed the old chapel. The castle was built in haste and with limited resources, initially to fend off the active threat of the Portuguese and English, and consequently the structure wasn't as robust as might have been hoped for, demonstrated in 1719 when the English invaded Vigo and reduced the castle to ruins, leaving just El Castro as the main defence of the town. In the period after the destruction by the English, the site became a space for livestock. The buildings were eventually repaired, spending time as a hospital before being converted back to military barracks, a role they served until 1964, when the castle was passed into the ownership of the city council. In 1970, the then mayor of Vigo decided to relocate the town hall up from the Plaza de la Constitución to the site of the castle, and to make way for this, large parts of the castle were demolished, leaving just a small part of the outer wall that remains today, having survived another attempt in 1983 to demolish what remained. Today, the ruins of the castle offer excellent views over the harbour and the old town. Just don't look behind you at the 1970s office block town hall, which hasn't aged well. Back on the ship, with plenty of time to spare, we were able to watch the not-so-high-tech work of dispatching a 21-year-old cruise ship out of port, with most of the work being undertaken by just one dock worker manning cranes, trucks and forklift. Though the fact we weren't supposed to be here might have meant only one person wanted the overtime to work for departure. And with a gentle push of the bow thrusters, we slowly eased away from the harbour and our place of shelter in Vigo, ready to start the journey back towards the Bay of Biscay and whatever that may throw at us. After a 180-degree turn in the estuary, the Ria de Vigo, we slowly started to sail down the channel towards its mouth into the Atlantic Ocean. Yep. The estuary and the city is protected in the worst of the Atlantic weather by the Ilias Seas, an archipelago of 3 islands that sit at the mouth of the estuary and form a natural barrier. Our route out of Vigo tonight took us on the Northern Passage, taking in a view of all 3 islands as we headed out to sea. The islands are the Ilha do Sur, Medio and Norte, but are more commonly known as the Ilha de San Martino, Ilha do Faro and Ilha de Monteado respectively, roughly translating as St Martin's, Lighthouse and Sharp Mount Islands. Whilst the southern of the island, St Martin, sits by itself, the other two islands are actually connected by a 1,200 metre long accumulation of sand known as Rodas Beach. At high tides, the sea floats between the islands from the western side, and blocked by the beach fills a lagoon between the beach and rocks of the island. The highest point on the island is, naturally, on Sharp Mount Island, with a peak of Alto das Cíes reaching 197 metres above sea level. Next time, we make a much less eventful crossing of the Bay of Biscay, arriving in Cherbourg to explore its maritime terminal and nuclear submarine.